uh, for taking the time out to come here. How many times do we use time in our sentence structure? It's just amazing. This human construct of time, and then the word is just used and stretched, and it's an adjective, it's a noun, it's a pronoun, it's everything. I'm Joe Medeiros, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Sierra College Press, and I'm a retired biology professor. We have an opportunity to explore another aspect of time today. Being a biologist, I just had to do something about biology. Last month we had Dick Hilton talk about the paleontological geologic time scale and the evolution of life over time. So we're going to carry that on just a little bit today and talk about lifetimes. But we've really had some fun with this intellectual salon. It's the brainchild of the Dean of Learning Resources here, Library and Learning Resources, Sabrina Pape, right here, who's our librarian. And it's a cooperative effort between the library and the Friends of the Library. And the chairman of the board of directors is Dr. David Dixon here, who's a retired language professor at Sierra College. And it's also Associated Students. I'm hoping, I see plenty of students here and so on, but Associated Students was involved in this too. We started it last semester. We started out with a crazy title. We had Barry Rice, an astronomer, physicist, astrophysicist, come and talk about the persistent and unreliable illusion of time. We then went the next month and talked about, if you think about that, the illusion of time, and he really warped our minds. By the way, all of the previous time salons are available right on the front of the web page. Go all the way down to the bottom, look for iTunes U, and look for guest lectures, and you can hear all the previous ones. So after really bending our minds about what time is or isn't, and how it's different depending upon where you are, how fast you're going, and this and that and the other. Most of us kind of spaced out after a while on that one. We talked about what humans do with time. We talked about time zones and daylight savings time and how strange it was. But that's part of the problem, is living on a sphere that spins around like this, not only going around the sun, but rotating on its own axis and so on. So we had to come up with some kind of a mechanism to measure it, but is it measurable? Then we had Josh Breeze come in and talk about the human obsession with time travel and science fiction writing and so on. And we ended up last semester with musicians in here talking about time and music. And as you well know, music is all about timing, or timing is all about music, or whatever. And so that was a real enjoyable event, or the whole semester was just marvelous. So we keep looking at this aspect, this construct of time. And so we started with Dick's lecture last month talking about paleontological time. But then we started thinking about, well, what's time to us in our lifetimes and so on. We're the ones that kind of designed it. We developed the idea and so on. We base it on the sun, or our travel around the sun, or this and that. But why are we obsessed with this construct? Why this aspect of time? And it seemed to us, as we discussed, that we base everything upon our lifespans, our lifetimes, and so on. So I thought that we would put our heads together and talk about what's the time of life, what's a lifetime to the many different organisms on Earth. And I asked my colleagues, Shauna Martinez in botany, and Jennifer Skillen in zoology, and I'll be the middleman ecologist here. We decided that we'd get together and talk about lifetimes that were very, very short, lifetimes that were moderate in length, like ours, and then really get into some of the older things. And so our presentation is called Lifespans, from Minutes to Millennia, and what's the meaning of life? What's time to a bristlecone? and see if we can't look at this in many different ways. And so we'll start with the short-lived things that, at least relative to our perception of them, the short-lived things, the itty-bitty creatures, and we'll start with Dr. Skillen, and she will talk about short lifetimes. So, Jenny, welcome, Jenny. So, thank you all for coming, and welcome. Drop it in. You got a back pocket, or there you go. Yeah, there we go.
Just clip that right there.
There, and should be good.
Okay. I feel so formal now. I'm all wired up. Okay, you got the. Go ahead.
The mic is only for the recording.
Yes. All right, I'm going to stand over on this side. Yeah, go ahead, Shauna.
Is it okay with you if we just pass this around? We'll tell you what this is
Sure.
all about. Enjoy it. Make sure that you open it up and smell the inside of it as you're.
And if you drop it,
I'll just give it another.
All right. Yeah, do smell that as it's going around. No one will think you're strange. So we thought we would start off with a couple of seemingly simple questions, because we're all teachers, so we like to ask questions that seem simple but really aren't. What is a life? And what is a lifespan? You're laughing. Yeah. What is a life? Is it simply how long you live? Is it simply how long you're aware of the world around you? How do you measure your life or your lifespan? Is it hours? Probably not for most of us. Is it years? Hopefully, for all of us, it is years. But are there other ways to measure it? Maybe you can measure your lifespan in terms of what you accomplish. Maybe that's more meaningful than in simply the amount of time you've spent on the planet. How do we compare lifespans of different organisms, whether they're plants or animals or fungus or bacteria or any other sort of organism? So as Joe said, we're going to start with some of the things that we think of as being very short-lived organisms. At least to our perspective, they're short-lived. So what do we have?
and you guys can jump in at any time. You can put your hand up, add comments. This is
Absolutely.
an intellectual salon.
Argue with us, it's all fine. Mayflies. All right, now mayflies often get listed as the organisms with the shortest lifespans. They are an insect. This is an adult mayfly up here. This is a hatch of mayflies. They are swarming everywhere. And they do indeed have very short lives as an adult. Lots of different species. Some of them may live only for a few hours. And what are they doing in those few hours? They are having sex as often as they possibly can. Reproduction in the adult life stage. That's why there's so many. They are trying to find that perfect someone. And hopefully that perfect someone is somewhere in that swarm. Sometimes these swarms get so huge they show up on Doppler radar. Can you imagine having a weather prediction for the mayflies? Happens all the time in the Midwest. That, I believe, is in Wisconsin. Every year for a period of a few weeks. As they emerge, they live for just a few hours. The really long-lived species, maybe a few days. But that's just in the adult stage. They can live for a couple of years as a larva, but we tend to discount that because we don't notice it. Okay, now you guys all know what these are, right?
Oh, everybody does.
Oh, that's what I thought, yeah. Okay, my zoology students, current and former, should. Phylum Gastrotricha. All right, these are microscopic animals. They are multi-celled animals, gastrotrichs. They live in the water. They're very small, and they have a very short lifespan, 3 days to 3 weeks. And yet they accomplish everything they need to do in that very short lifespan. So they're successful. Right? They have a fulfilled life. They manage to do it all in just a few weeks. Would you be happy with just a few weeks? Yeah.
How magnified is that?
It is very magnified. I'm trying to see.
That's
that say 20?
Yeah.
25. I think this is either 20 or 25 micrometers, and a micrometer is a millionth of a meter. Yeah.
Those are much smaller than a sand grain. They crawl in between sand grains.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. Very, very small. Yeah, go ahead. Cicadas. I love cicadas. How many of you have heard about cicadas? Okay, I know zoology students, you guys have heard about cicadas. Yeah, have you heard cicadas buzzing in the summer? We have them here.
I'm from Missouri.
Oh, yes.
It hurts.
It does. The decibel level is deafening. Absolutely. Okay, so they are an insect. They are famous in the insect world for their very bizarre life cycles. There are some species of cicada that emerge periodically. They're called periodical cicadas. They have a lifespan that is centered around prime numbers, 13 years or 17 years. So they can do math. They know what prime numbers are. They can't really do math. When they emerge and metamorphose into their adult state, once again, they're only after one thing. They have a few weeks to find as many mates as possible, reproduce as much as possible, and they buzz. They make a really loud buzzing noise. That's how they say, I'm over here, come and find me. And it's deafening, especially when you have millions per square acre. So we feel like they have a very short lifespan, but again, they're juvenile, they're larval stage, they are underground. They look kind of like this when they're underground. This is just an exoskeleton, a shell. But they spend years underground, in some cases 17 years. So they have a very long life, but we don't see it. So we typically think of them again as having a very short lifespan because we're not aware of most of their lifespan. Yeah, let's see. Okay, a house mouse. I thought I better get something a little larger, a little furrier in here. I don't know if you'd think of it as cute. Probably depends. It's got fur. It's kind of cute. There are some mice that are cuter than a house mouse. A house mouse, a little bit bigger than the things that we've looked at so far. How long does a typical mouse live? You've never contemplated that. Do you think they live for just a few weeks or a few years?
A few years.
Certainly a few years in some species of mice, absolutely. For the house mouse, this particular species, found around the world now thanks to humans, 9 months to a year for a mammal. And yet they are abundant. They are everywhere. They can survive in all sorts of habitats. And in that year, they can have lots and lots of offspring. I had to bring my notes because I don't remember the exact number. They can reach sexual maturity in 6 to 10 weeks. So even though they may only live a year, by the time they're 10 weeks old, they can have offspring, and they have 5 or 6 at a time. And 10 weeks later, 6 to 10 weeks later, those offspring can have offspring. That's how you get inundated with house mice in a hurry. So, yeah, they don't live a long time, but once again, they manage to do everything they need to do in that seemingly short lifespan. Do you think it feels short to them?
No.
Probably not. They may have a different perception of how fast time is going. Yeah. All right, here's a question for you. Is a life cycle the same as a generation? Oh. We name generations of people. What generation are you part of? Do you know the name for your generation? Some are baby boomers, millennials, Generation X, Generation Y. Now we have Generation Z. Apparently my kids are part of Generation Z. Oh. I just heard that on the radio the other day. Oh, there's a name. I don't know where we go after Z. I feel like they missed most of the alphabet. I mean, they started with X and they did Y. Are we going to go back to A? I don't know. So what's a generation? A group of people, or organisms, and what do they have in common? Yeah, they're all born within a certain time period. Right? So we've got this generation, that generation. There is no firm dividing line between one generation and the next. You can have in a family, and maybe your own family is like this, you can have individuals who are cousins, first cousins. So they're part of the same generation in the family, and they might be 20 or 30 years apart in age. So they're really not part of the same cultural generation. So generation, kind of a wishy-washy term. All right, so I put a picture of a monarch here. What do you guys know about monarchs? What's special?
Milkweed.
Milkweed. Milkweed, they like it, milkweed. They're pretty.
They migrate.
They migrate. Okay, let's look at the next one, Shauna. They migrate a really long way. Some of them go all the way to Mexico. But the complete migratory cycle, going to Mexico, spending the winter, coming back, is not one single monarch. It is multiple generations. So in a sense, the biological lifespan of that species is go to Mexico, come back, but that takes multiple individual generations. Some of them do go to Mexico, they'll spend the winter, they may start to fly back, they'll fly part of the way, they'll stop, they'll lay eggs. You get caterpillars, they turn into butterflies, they go a little farther north, and it repeats again a few weeks later. It may take 5 or 6 generations to reach the Corn Belt, to reach the northern part of their range. How do they know that? They track them. Little dots of paint. Yeah.
And the monarch butterflies don't do that.
How do they know to do that? They know which way to go, even though they haven't done it. Their grandparents did it, or did part of the journey, and yet they don't get lost. Can you imagine? Just because somebody in your family came across the plains on a covered wagon, you would know how to get back? Doesn't work for us, but they somehow have ingrained in their DNA how to navigate. And they know which way to go. And most of them make it. Right? There's probably a few that take a wrong turn and end up in Tahiti. And they just stay there and enjoy it and don't bother to come back. I've never taken a wrong turn and ended up in Tahiti. I end up in uglier places. All right, what else do we have? Oh, bacteria. Definitely short-lived. And sometimes we kind of forget about bacteria. We focus on plants and animals, but bacteria are living organisms too. Do we need them? Yeah, we do. I know there's some we could do without. There's certainly some that you may have had personal experience with that you don't care to meet again. But bacteria, thousands and thousands of species, do they ever die? Well, yeah, one individual bacteria. Sure, you bombard it with antibiotics and you can kill that sucker, right? And get rid of that one bacteria. What would a bacteria do in the absence of modern medicine when it has acquired enough energy and it's feeling fat and happy? It's gonna divide. So now you have 2, and we would consider that offspring. Do we still have the original? Yeah. So when those 2 offspring, when they divide, we still have the first one. It's in pieces. We haven't really lost the first one. There's a continuity there. So how do you measure the lifespan of a bacteria? We typically measure it in how long does it take before it divides. We take the easy way out, and we don't really try to define how long an individual lives. We just say it'll exist this long and then it will divide. And how long is that? In some species, maybe 15 minutes. In other species, maybe a few hours. In the really slow species, maybe a day. Can you imagine 15 minutes? Yeah, that's why I used to tell my Bio 1 classes, that's why when you leave the tuna sandwich on the counter in the morning, you don't eat it when you come home that night. Just think about how many bacteria might be there if they multiply every 15 minutes. Yeah, bad idea. Okay, what else do we have? Oh, pictures of bacteria. Right, so here's one that is dividing. It's not losing any of its parts, it's just splitting in half. Yeah. All right, here's an easy question. Can individuals be immortal? Not currently. I'm not going to last forever?
We don't know yet. It's not the end of time.
Okay, not the end of time.
That's a good point.
That's right. It's not over till it's over. So I know some of you who have had zoology with me might know what this creature is. It is a jellyfish. Do you know the name? No. The common name for this thing? The immortal jellyfish. Now this creature, when scientists realized what it was doing, most of them, I think, said to themselves, oh no, it's not doing that. Is it? Really? It can't do that. With a jellyfish, like most things, it goes through a life cycle. You are born or hatched, you go through this larval development stage, you gradually change into your adult form, you have offspring, and eventually you deteriorate in old age and you reach the end of your life. This jellyfish says, if conditions start to look a little iffy and it thinks it might not survive, it does the Benjamin Button thing. Did you guys see the movie Benjamin Button? It goes backwards. It turns back into a juvenile, turns back into essentially a larval state. We can't go backwards. Our cells are specialized. You've got nerve cells and muscle cells and bone cells. We can't turn them back into an embryo, into a stem cell. They don't go backwards. Immortal jellyfish, they go backwards. And they go back to being a juvenile jelly. And the juvenile jelly is this polyp instead of the adult jelly. And then when things look better, it says, okay, I'll try it again. They get do-overs. They try it again. They turn into the adult. Now, in the lab, because it's the easiest way to actually count how many times they can do this, they have seen it happen 12 times in the lab. Take them back, they develop forwards, take them back, they develop forward. 12 do-overs. Think of what you could accomplish if you could do high school all over again now that you know what you know.
Dangerous.
Yeah, okay, maybe not. We're not going to let Joe go back and do it again. We don't know what the limit is for this species. How many times can it go back? Is there a limit? We have no idea.
Because isn't there something at the end of the telomeres that starts to fray when you age? So
Yeah.
it's-
I mean, that's essentially what we think aging is, because every time our cells divide, the DNA, your chromosomes, the end of the chromosomes shrinks a little bit. And at first you've got a big buffer on the end of your chromosomes, but eventually you wear through that buffer. And at that point, when they shrink, you're losing important DNA. And you can only lose so much DNA and still function. Yeah, you really can't afford to lose much DNA. So I don't know if we know if these guys operate that same way. Yeah.
Next one?
Yep. Okay, can you tell what that is in the picture? It's a chrysalis, yeah. I don't know who's inside it, but it's a chrysalis. It's some sort of a moth or a butterfly. So another easy question. I like easy questions. If all of an individual's cells are replaced, is it still the same individual? Huh. So we start with a caterpillar. It's got caterpillar cells. They're put together in the shape of a caterpillar. It behaves like a caterpillar. It goes into the chrysalis. And inside there, really pretty much everything sort of melts and turns into caterpillar goo. And then it reassembles, and it's a butterfly.
She's not lying to you.
Yeah.
The human,
Yeah. It just,
melts.
yeah.
The humans reproduce all their cells within a 7-year period.
Most, not all.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, some of your cells are brand new since yesterday. And some of your cells you have had for years. And will have for many more years, as long as you treat them right. Yeah.
So this caterpillar still has the same DNA after it comes out.
Yes.
Okay.
It still has the same DNA. But basically, it takes all of its cells apart and rebuilds them.
Okay.
Turns to caterpillar jello.
Yeah. Caterpillar jello. And then out of that jello, it reassembles a butterfly. And yet we know that it retains memories.
So there are sponges that you can run through a sieve. A sponge, a well-organized sponge, just run it through a sieve,
Yeah,
separate it.
yeah.
In a blender.
In a blender, yeah.
Separate it out into all of its individual cells,
Right.
set the jar down, it will reorganize into the same sponge, because it has the knowledge.
Yeah. And sponges are animals, for those of you who may not have thought about what a sponge is. They don't look like a mammal by any means. Yeah.
Didn't you read Alice in Wonderland? This was, the caterpillar did this, and Alice in Wonderland.
It may have had other help in that book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rust.
Is this the same thing, the same reason that my eldest daughter acts just like her grandfather, even though he died before she was born?
She's transmogrified.
Genetics. Yeah.
If all of the material is removed from the chrysalis,
Mm-hmm.
and put into a different kind of environment, and it's even controlled with heat, light and everything else similar to what would be in the chrysalis,
Uh-huh.
can we expect the same thing to occur that the rebuilding?
Would you still get a butterfly? I don't know.
Take place?
I don't know if anybody has done that. You guys heard of
We
any?
expect to get a report on that next year.
Okay, right. Okay,
Are they all
well,
does it just break all its cells into little individual cells, or do the cells
Uh-uh.
themselves break down?
they break
So
down.
it's just a soup of DNA and all types of
And
organic.
proteins and, all the stuff is still there, but it's no longer organized.
Okay.
Yeah, it is definitely crazy. There is no way we would survive if we had to consciously facilitate that process, but they managed to do it just fine. Yeah. What else do we have here?
So,
Oh, and our cricket.
you want me to take over?
Yep, yep. Let's trade here.
Just for a second. So, one of the things that we were talking about is everything that we biologists or as humans do is we look at species and we record this event and that event and another event, and then we say, well, it took X number of hours or days and stuff to do that. But what if we're using our time schedule and not theirs? Maybe we should be thinking the way a gastro trick does, or other how short-lived things do. How can we think in that fashion? Here we live all 60, 80, 90, 100 years, something like that. But what if you had a lifespan of a cricket? Do you have to do something now? So listen carefully to this YouTube and what she has to say.
What you are hearing is a recording of crickets. There are 2 tracks. One is played at regular speed, and the other is a slowed down version. Crickets have a faster lifespan than humans do. Their sounds are slowed down to the equivalent of a human lifespan. What you are hearing are the crickets only. No instruments or voices are added. Listen.
Isn't that amazing? But what we think we hear, and we know what a cricket sounds like, if you take their lifespan and extend it, or take proportionately that same amount of time and expand it into a human lifespan, slow that thing down then, in other words, and we hear a completely different song. I think Shauna's up next, right? So.
I'll get it. Somehow I gotta get this on. Good. And yeah, you guys heard that. You're singing it now? I know. That's amazing. Well, now I get to talk about the things that kind of match our lifespan, and also, go ahead. Consider those single individual lifespans that are much, much longer than the ones we've just discussed. How does one of their days actually compare to one of ours? You hit it. What exactly then is middle-aged? We talked about essentially the purpose of the short lifespans to actually get in there and reproduce and die. You know, just get in, reproduce, death. Well, consider actually that the green sea turtle lives approximately the same time that we do, about 80 years, which is amazing. It reaches sexual maturity between the same time we do too, 20 to 50 years. It reaches the sexual maturity then, about the same time, but it will lay eggs for the rest of its life. What is middle age to it? Does it ever get a day off? We talk about retirement after the end of our reproductive lifespan. There's a whole bunch of our life that exists after reproduction, isn't there? And we get to kind of hopefully enjoy it at the very end. Well, some of these species actually don't. Well, let's take a look at some of the animals. Yeah, I'm a botanist, but I'm going to look at animals first to take a look at those kinds of species that have lifespans that are really, really similar to ours. So how do we compare? These are actually lifespans that are at the end, the longest kind of lifespan you can get. Okay, so the human, actually the oldest living human was about 122 years, which is phenomenally old. You know, that's not the average lifespan, but that's the oldest lifespan. Huh? Oh, I can't, I know, kind of amazing. So how much after middle-aged is that person? Stunning. A horse, the oldest living horse is about 62, so it's kind of right in there. Asian elephants live to be about 86 years old, which is phenomenally old. I like the macaw. You know, we don't think of birds as living that long, but they do. 80 to 100 years, a scarlet macaw, which is stunning lifespan, similar to ours. The Greenland shark, a kind of a rare shark, about 200 years this thing has been found to live, which is stunning. You think, oh my gosh, that's so old. The tortoise, 190 years old. I mean, that's phenomenal. That's double, easily double our lifespan. And then, of course, the bowhead whale. There's some of the lifespans of these guys are measured in their otoliths. We're not quite sure because people haven't been around studying that individual since they were born, but we can determine what kind of lifespan they might have based upon little ear bones, okay, that they have, which is kind of interesting how they can do that. Well, it's easy to see the historical context of these animals as these animals actually live their lives, since their life approximates ours. But what about the ones that are much older? Any guesses? Hang on. Oh, the plants. Okay, go. How many lifetimes by comparison? Now, I put some historical context in here, and I want you to think about this. Because consider the oak tree that's in your yard. How many of you have oak trees in your yard? In your yards? The oak tree in your yard might have been a seedling when Henry VIII executed his second wife, Anne Boleyn. How long can they live? 100 to 600 years. It's kind of interesting. I find this part kind of interesting and jump in. I think it's fascinating how we can have an Antiquities Act that says we can't disturb human artifacts over 50 years old. Except for trees, because they're not a human artifact. And we don't consider that. What have they seen in their lifetime? I mean, if they could see, what could they have experienced in their lifetime? What kind of climate changes could have existed in their lifetime? How many droughts in their lifetime? We can only experience it from our very short period of time as an animal. Next slide. I have one better. How about the Sierra juniper, when it was a sapling, the founder of Buddhism was living? I know. How old is that? About 2,500 years ago. These trees, as an individual, can live 2,500 years, which is just stunning. When you walk up next to one of these trees, go to the next slide. When you walk up next to these trees, can you feel that life of 2,500 years and sitting in space in that time and that location for that long? How much erosion has occurred in those years? It's kind of stunning to think about. Go to the next one. I have one better than that. And they're all trees, by the way. It's just one of those things. Trees live a long time. The giant sequoia was setting its first seeds at the beginning of the Iron Age, when the world population was 50 million. How many people in the United States currently? About 300 million. Yeah, that's in the entire world. These guys were just setting their very first seeds. An individual, right? How old are they? About 3,000 years. A single tree could have sat in that one spot for 3,000 years. That's a phenomenal lifespan. I think about, the visitors that came to see, that came by and, over all of the modernization of humans and roads and cars and, way back when, yeah. Okay, I got one better than that. Go. And that's the one that actually passed around as the box. This is actually, you haven't seen it, they haven't seen it. So the bristlecone pine, the granddaddy of them all, agriculture began in North Africa when this tree was just beginning its life. How old is that? 5,000 years old, which is stunning to think. Sitting in one spot for that long a period of time. I kind of put myself in a tree's position. I'd be kind of bored. Right?
I feel like I go back to the time of being relative to how old you are.
Exactly. Right. But to them, it's their life. That's the entire life. And talk about reproduction, reproduce till you die. These guys actually, all of these trees I showed you, once they reach sexual maturity, they continue to reproduce until the day they die. Okay? Continue to reproduce until the day they die. That box is around 500 years, if you count the rings. That was a bristlecone pine that was done as a fence post. It was a long time ago. They used to cut these trees down. Talk about the Antiquities Act. It's like, oh my God. I can't imagine. But they're taking old fence posts now and reconfiguring them into jewelry boxes, which is nice. So I have a little piece, and it smells just wonderful. You get around these trees, and again, you can just feel their presence. You know, how to think about, you know, this beginning of agriculture when these guys were young. A single branch can be 30 years from this long to this long, 30 years old, single branch. Yeah?
You know, we spent time there too. But my question is, how were the conditions such as to be able to create the longevity of these? I mean, surely the climate, also the high elevation, other factors must have really played some kind of a very important role in making this happen. Climatology, has that been pretty
It's-
much measured with this?
You can actually see where these trees used to exist and don't any longer, because the wood doesn't decay very rapidly. And so, you know, climate change has come and gone, up and down the hills, right? So lower elevation, higher, slightly higher elevation. Will these trees endure our climate change today? That's a super good question. So those are the old guys. What about the old guys? Come on, Joe. Did you like that segue?
Bring a silverback up, right?
Hey, I'm joining you there.
Now, many of these old fence posts that that Shawna was talking about were really from dead trees out in the White Mountains up above. So they would use these old trees because if you look at the box, the rings are as close as 100 rings per inch. That means it would take 100 years for the tree to put an inch more of girth or thickness on its wood in its lifetime, or you know. And their needles are older, twice as old as you kids out here. They'll build a needle and it'll stay on for 40 years, something like that. So we thought the oldest known individual bristlecone was cut down on Wheeler Peak, but they just found one in the White Mountains of California that was 5,056 years old and still alive. Being able to count those rings and go all the way back and look at climate change, because a wide ring is a wetter year and a closer ring is a drier year and so on. In addition to that, you can literally go into radiocarbon dating any one of those little segments and fine-tune your radiocarbon dating devices. Keith?
Did they core that to get that?
Yeah. They would core those. When you core a tree, you're going through 99.9% dead tissue. And you pull that core out, and the resin fills up the hole, and you're all good again. So, okay. So we've been talking about two different kinds of things, sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Those things that just divide and produce exactly the same individual, the bacteria and things of this nature, are cloning. They're producing an exact replica. There may be some modifications, but they're not like sexual reproduction, where there's a special kind of division and gametes are formed, a sperm and an egg that have half the number of chromosomes that go wandering out there and hopefully find another one of the same species, reunite to come back to the same chromosome number, but a different genetic combination, right? We've always thought, well, sexual reproduction is obviously the better mechanism because it allows for variation in the population, and you'll have a better strength within the environment, and you'll have all the variation that can tolerate change and this and that and the other. But what about these bacteria that have been going on and on and on? And what is it about cloning, right? And what is cloning? Does cloning happen in multicellular organisms as well as unicellular organisms? Bacteria are unicellular organisms. Amoebas are unicellular organisms. But the gastrotrix, those are they multicellular? They're multicellular. We'll show you some other things. So if you've been out in the desert and found creosote bush, this beautiful flower here is in a desert shrub. Well, Frank Vasek from Southern California was looking at aerial photographs out in the desert and noticed rings. Why is this creosote growing in rings? And so he went over to a leaf over here and did a DNA fingerprint test on it, and then went to the other side of the ring and took some other leaves out there and did DNA fingerprint tests on them. They were identical. So what's going on here? Took all these leaves, from all the way around, they're absolutely identical to each other. So he starts, well, if this is in fact a cloning type of situation, where's the individual that began? So in sexual reproduction, sperm meets egg or pollen meets egg, seed is formed, new embryo, new generation grow up and so on. But if that organism can clone via mitosis, the cell, just simple cell division, maybe they can grow outward. So he started digging around in the dirt, in the sand, looking for, this is out in the Mojave Desert, so he was looking for wood that had not yet decomposed. Thank goodness it was out in the desert. He found lots of wood all the way in here. He found wood in here and radiocarbon dated it. It was 9,000 years. He radiocarbon dated it here. It was, I'm sorry, it went the other way around. These branches here are 50 years old. And here in the dirt, the roots were 100 years old, all the way into the center, and he got into the central wood that was over 11,000 years old. So a seed fell here right after the ice melts, the Ice Age, and this thing starts 11,000 years ago, keeps growing, the old stuff dies, and it just keeps radiating out as a radial clone, right? And that, he named that clone King Clone, by the way. So, next slide. So, the humongous fungus, right? This is actually a blow up of a mushroom that's only about this big. Go ahead and hit the next slide. This is the biggest. No, I'm just kidding. So, oh my gosh, a GSM, a good-sized mushroom, right? So, yeah.
With the fungus, you have the fairy rings out in the forest of fungus. Is that the same?
That's exactly what's going on. Let's go back to the humongous fungus. I really don't have a picture of it, but when you see a fairy ring, a spore has hit the ground. Mycelia are growing and dividing mitotically just by cloning underneath. And then when the time is right, all of that mycelia that's gone out in a radius will pop up mushrooms around in a ring. They're all identical. They're all exact clones of the central thing. So the humongous fungus has been doing this. Well, what's the biggest thing in the world and what's the oldest thing? The humongous fungus has been in southeastern Oregon, Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. Does it sound familiar to anyone? Anyway, they've got a fungus up there. I've already forgotten the numbers. It's 2,500 acres of mycelium inside. So you don't see mushrooms everywhere. You see them out on the edges. But you go into the soil and look at the fungal mycelia and identify it, and it's the same as that and that and that and that. It's growing underneath. It's 2,500 acres. It's over 8,000 years old. And it weighs thousands. It actually, what is it? 6,000 tons. 6,000. So is that, and we don't know if it's older than that. Next slide. That's just a joke. Quaking aspens. After the Ice Age, quaking aspens had a really hard time. Quaking aspen is this beautiful tree that you well know with fall color and so on. And it reproduces teeny tiny seeds. Sexually, there are male trees and female trees. And so the pollen blows to the female trees, a little seed is formed, but it's got to land in some really moist soils. But things became drier and drier and drier after the Ice Age, right? And so it turns out that these quaking aspens rarely reproduce sexually anymore because of the drying climate. So when you go through an aspen grove, it's not a grove at all, you're driving through an aspen tree. That's an individual. Imagine a tree laying down on the ground, under the ground, and these are all of its branches going outward and upward. Any one of these trees, if you count the rings, may only be 150 years old or less. But the clone can be 8,000, 10,000, 11,000 years old, older than the bristlecones. But does that make the bristlecone unimportant? The bristlecone is the oldest individual sexually reproduced tree in the world, or per organism, right? But these are some of the oldest clones in the world. So who's older? Well, the genetics of this tree is far older than the bristlecone. And there are people, science is showing that these things could be 500,000 to 1,000,000 years old, right? And if you really think about what this clone is doing since the Ice Age, it's creeping around underneath the ground looking for nutrients. And once they exhaust the nutrients in one area, it'll move into another. If we could have a time-lapse aerial photograph of this clone over the past 10,000 years and add a little music to it, it might go around through the topography and so on. And now it's right here. Unfortunately, there's a new disease that's killing these things as well. So anyway, so the idea of age in cloning is different. This is called pando in the Greek, which means I grow or I expand or something like that. And that's in Utah. So you can go visit Pando, a 11, 12,000-year-old grove. If you've driven through groves in the Sierra Nevada, they're not groves. Groves are numerous different trees living in the same spot. You're driving through a tree, right, which is really kind of a fun concept. So why are we obsessed with our version of time, right? You know, I'm born, I go through high school. Man, would I do it differently again this time. But it's always our lifetimes. And then why are we sad when we even conceive of dying or passing on? What is the objective? What are the objectives of life biologically? Let's think like biologists here. You've really only got two things that their DNA requires you to do. Well, that's the second one. Grow so that you can become reproductive and reproduce, right? That's it, right? And there you go, and then you die. That's what we think and so on. But so why are we dissatisfied? My kids are in their 40s. I've reproduced 40 some years ago and so on. Why do I still want to cling so much to life? And then that of course takes us into much more philosophical things and love and memory and history and all of these marvelous things and so on. And maybe it's fear of death, fear of not having the afterlife, or whatever it happens to be. But we are obsessed with time, aren't we? Aren't the cells of reproduction just a continuum of life? Aren't we all just traveling in time via the expression of our DNA? This is from Monty Python's The Meaning of Life. Every sperm is sacred, right? You know, so. Are we done when we reproduce or not? Deloid, you don't pronounce the B. The B is silent, so why put it there? I have no idea. There was a guy named Bedell that named it. Rotifers are microscopic. You need a microscope to see them, and they're multicellular. They have tissues. Tissues mean certain cells that do some things and certain cells that do other things and so on. If this was human size, this would be one scary predator, because they've got these whirling devices and they eat anything that they can get into their mouth, right? And they'll do that. But we have evidence now that illustrate that these have been females only, and they've been Some of the species have dealt. There's a whole group of them, but they're females only, and they've been reproducing asexually all this time. So they're clones of each other. Some of the species may be 20 million years old. But they do some pretty interesting things. Some of the things that they eat, they say, that's really an interesting gene. I think I'll take that and incorporate it into my own DNA. It's called horizontal gene transfer, something like that. Just line it up alongside your chromosomes and take it in and use it. Other species, They're just looking for the right genes, and DNA could be completely different species. So does this dispel the idea that sexual reproduction is the best way to move through time and evolve and be prepared for change and this and that and the other? 20 million years without sex and no complaints? I don't know. We don't know their language yet. They might be complaining. So, before there's only one more slide, right? So there's only one more slide. What are you thinking about this? What is a lifespan? What is a generation? And have we established all of our understanding of time just based upon our own parameters, our own construct, our own?
I can tell you after this, I feel a lot younger.
Dr. Amigo, what do you think about this?
Yeah, it's a way of even. I mean, I'm coming back to what you just said about which is better, and even with asexual, you could have the future generations start looking a little different at every step. For what I researched, it was paleontology, so I'm not looking at live organisms like you do, but I'm looking at phytoplankton, and it is reproducing asexually, but we're looking at, because I'm again doing paleontology, it's millions and millions of years, and there's ways of tracking, what led to what, and there's huge changes as they're adapting to different salinity in the water, to different temperature in the water, because they have to float, right? They need to have the sun. So they grow spines, they don't grow them, they get flatter, they get rounder. So, but it is asexual.
Right. Keith?
On that, genetic diversity also, say you're doing asexual reproduction, you have the same genes, wouldn't that also in effect that if something attacks that one specific organism, they can wipe out that whole species if they don't have enough genetic diversity to
Right.
carry on the life? This is kind of
We've kind of developed this hierarchy. Sexual reproduction is better than asexual reproduction and so on. But these Deloid rotifers have figured out how to change their genetics and have diversity within their species and so on by just simply absorbing it and still dividing, and bacteria the same thing. The most interesting thing is it still all works, right? And really the most interesting thing is that life is pretty darn fascinating, isn't it? Richard Dawkins wrote in The Selfish Gene, this is an old book, but this is a marvelous quote. We die as individuals, but the gene doesn't. It never even grows old, but it leaps from body to body down through all the generations, manipulating each in turn for its own ends, abandoning a long succession of convenient vehicles along the evolutionary highway where they lie rotting on the side of the road until another genetic passenger comes along and scavenges the spare parts to build itself a better gene machine, right? So we'll never die. Our DNA never dies, right? We are just simply DNA's way of making more DNA. Thanks for using your body. We're going to cast you aside and move you on.
It begs the question, what's life?
Thoughts? We hope. Sorry?
That's life. Is that like Frank Sinatra's version of it?
Yeah. Always look on the bright side of life, right? So, well, thank you for coming. I hope that it was worth your time. And if you get a chance to go to the White Mountains, drive down the east side, drive down 395, go south of Bishop to Big Pine, head up into the bristlecone pines, take a walk amongst the oldest living trees in the world, lean up against one of them, spend an hour listening to it, keep your eyes closed, hear it, and learn from it, and be amazed that life continues in spite of us in our mechanisms and contrivances and so on. These things have lived for 5,000 years. May they live for 5,000 more, and allow our children and grandchildren to enjoy them and learn from them, and keep on learning. Thanks so much for coming to our intellectual salon today. So. Oh, there's a flex sign-in sheet right up here for those of you that need that. And come and get another hit if you need to. So.